Good morning. Your bulletin says that Brian Gerard is preaching. He's not. I am. And I am Julie Richardson and one of the pastors on staff here at First, and happy to be with you this morning. I do have a question for you as we get started. When is the last time that any of you have ever read the book of Nehemiah? Actually, you've read it? Awesome. You are my hero. That is fantastic. Absolutely. It absolutely counts. It's not a book that we spend a lot of time with in the Bible. That seriously just made my day. But we are going to spend some time in it this morning. But you don't even have to open it up if you don't want to, because we're just going to look at one verse, and I'm just going to give it to you right now. Nehemiah chapter 4, verse 6. So we rebuilt the wall, and all the wall was joined together to half its height, for the people had a mind to work. Nehemiah chapter 4, verse 6. I have had that verse committed to memory since I was about 16, and here's why. I grew up in a little town called Winder. It's in Georgia, just northeast of Atlanta. Its claim to fame is that it's the home of Senator Richard B. Russell and lots of chicken factories. It's about 25 miles from the stadium where the Georgia Bulldogs play. And Winder is not so small anymore, but when I was a kid, it was a pretty small town. And my world essentially existed between the three corners of a lopsided triangle made by my high school, only high school in the county, the church where my dad served as pastor across the street. That was fun. And my house right down the road, the house where I grew up. These three landmarks sort of formed this little mile of space where I spent most of my time. It's what I knew. On Friday nights in the fall, most of Winder, in fact, most of Barrow County, descended upon my little lopsided triangle of existence because our own Bulldogs, the Winder Barrow High School Bulldogs, probably had a home football game. And the football stadium was, as they often are in small towns in the South, probably the most well-constructed and impressive structure in the whole county. Totally Friday night lights, y'all. It was a social event, it was a sporting event, it was the place to be seen. Grand and glorious, and the lights of this stadium could be seen over the whole central part of the town when they were lit up. Most every other evening, if the weather was pleasant, my mom and I had an after-dinner habit of walking from our house up to the high school and around the block surrounding it a few times and back home for exercise, and it amounted to a few miles. But it also came around one side, our path came around one side of the football stadium. And at the corner of the stadium was the Winder Barrow High School Bulldog Field House. And if our evening walk coincided with football practice, and it often did because I had a terrible crush on number 36. If it coincided with football practice, we heard a sound that I promise you, you will never hear anywhere else. And I can't even do it justice, but this is what you would hear as you came around the corner. This big booming voice, "So built we the wall." And then you would hear this echo back of this chorus, "So built we the wall." And then, "And the wall was joined together." And the wall was joined together. And then this lead voice would just explode in a deafening yell, "For the people had a mind to work." And then you'd hear again, "For the people had a mind to work." And then there'd be all manner of yelling and the sound of helmets being clapped and whistles and hollers. That first voice, that big, booming voice, it belonged to Coach Isaiah Berry. And Coach Berry, who, in my memory anyway, was larger than life. This enormous man, skin as dark as night and a smile as bright as those Friday night lights. And the chorus answering him in that call and response was the varsity football team. whipped into a frenzy and ready to do whatever their coach asked them to do. Because thanks to Coach Barry, they had a mind to work. I'm not sure I've ever seen a group of people follow voluntarily and so single-mindedly another person. So all in. These boys, they came from all over the county. All different skin colors, all different socioeconomic backgrounds. Most of them didn't even go to church. But in that field house, they were one. And they knew Nehemiah 4:6. I don't know how much you know about Nehemiah. As I've said, he's not really a biblical character we talk about a lot, but it's an important story in the history of Jerusalem. Most folks who study these sorts of things think that Nehemiah was a lay leader of some sort in the Persian court. But his people were of Jerusalem. And at the time that Nehemiah was living and serving in the Persian court, it was a really bad time for Jerusalem. In fact, the people in Jerusalem were just about as low as you can get as a community. This was post-King David, post-King Solomon, and the temple that Jerusalem had been known for and that had defined its life together had been destroyed. The city's population had dwindled, and it wasn't much to look at, having gone through so much destruction and conflict. The heritage of Hebrew language and culture was at stake. In other words, everything the mighty Jerusalem had been was no longer. And they were at a rock bottom low in terms of their identity as a community. Nehemiah knew this, and his heart broke for the nation and culture of his ancestry. And out of his heartache, he found himself searching for a way to help. And so finally he asked the Persian king if he could go and help rebuild the city of his birth. Both physically and spiritually was his goal. But he started with the city's walls, using the physical task of rebuilding the walls of the city to also build spiritual community. I don't know if you've ever been part of building a wall of any kind, but it is not easy work. And I am sure it sometimes seemed hopeless. But Nehemiah and his workers did it. And in doing so, they helped Jerusalem recognize that not all was lost. Perhaps things would never be as they once had been, but there was still hope for their city, for their culture, and most importantly, for their faith. When I read Nehemiah's story, I am always reminded that church, as it once was, is not any longer. Church is no longer the communal or civic center of our life together. And there are all sorts of theories about that, and we could spend many Sundays dicing all those theories out. But the end result is the same. Things are not as they once were. And so if we want the stories of our faith to survive past the generations currently claiming that faith, we have to be willing to think about what church means in this day and time. Church in 1956 is no longer, and we are not going back. So what does it mean in 2017? In a vastly more complex, connected, diverse, and polarized world. What does it mean for us, like Nehemiah, to search for a way to bind ourselves back together as a community in the midst of transition, in the midst of change, in the midst of division? I don't have a solid answer for that. But I do have a suspicion about where some of the answers might be found. And it isn't necessarily at 8:30, 9:30, or 11 on Sunday morning. Hear me when I say that there is a time and place for gathering for worship. It feeds us. It draws us closer together. It draws us closer to God. It grounds us for the week ahead. It reminds us through prayer and song and words and bread broken why it is that we call ourselves followers of Jesus in the first place. But the truth is that neither God or Jesus really need our worship. What they need is our action. What they need is our willingness to step outside and see where we might be needed. Our hands-on, no excuses, unconditional love for the world that God has created. And that means that we might have to get our hands in the muck and get dirty. That means that we might have to be uncomfortable. It means letting go sometimes of what we thought we knew, of stepping out from behind the ruin of our dearly held assumptions and beliefs and being willing to build something new. And the thing is, all around you are images of the headway that you all have already made in this regard. All around you in this sanctuary is visual proof of the way that you all have been the hands and feet of Christ in this community, and that is no small thing. But also, do not hear me saying that what we do inside these walls doesn't matter too. Because it does. It's everything. Especially when it comes to teaching our children the faith. And whether that's on Sunday morning or Sunday afternoon or Tuesday night, I don't care when it is, but we cannot assume that the stories of our faith are part of our common culture anymore, because they aren't. And that's okay. In fact, I think it probably helps us take our faith more seriously because we can no longer take it for granted. If we're serious about loving God and following Jesus as best we can, we have to teach our kids the same. And we have to create space for them to live their life as they see fit. Because they will express their faith differently than us. And that alone often makes us uncomfortable. The bottom line is this. We live in a world where people are desperate to belong to anything. And not a one of us longs for anything more in this life than we long to be loved. And we live in a world where loneliness and anxiety and depression are at an all-time high, despite our instant connectivity and our constant social media chatter. We live in a world where people are aching to fill the God-shaped holes in their hearts. And it has never been more important for us to tell the very good news that we are, in fact, incomparably and unconditionally loved. And yet, even with this good news that we know, we still seem to have lost sight of what matters most. And that is our life together. There's a lot telling us how we're all different. But what Nehemiah teaches us is how much we have to fight for together. Because we forget that it takes all of us working together to build anything at all. Most certainly if we plan to build a kinder and gentler world than the one we currently live in. We forget that this life, it is not an individual sport. No matter what we North Americans have been led to believe about bootstraps and individualism and manifest destiny and all that, life is not an individual sport, and certainly our faith isn't. And if we have any hope of standing strong, we have to do so together. We forget that our way is not always the best way. In fact, our way was once often seen as misguided, as we often accuse our young people of being. we forget, out of our own fear and anxiety about the state of the world, that we were, in fact, never asked to do this thing called faith alone. We've never been asked to build our communities alone. That was never part of the deal. We do this life with a goodness and a love greater than we could ever possibly imagine building right along beside us, always and in every way. One of the things that was so profound and effective about Nehemiah's work is that he made it a true group project. By all accounts, everyone was invited to be part of his campaign for a better and brighter and more hopeful Jerusalem. And even though the Bible doesn't say this, so I'm taking some license here, I imagine that even children helped him carry bricks. And aging grandmothers brought water to the workers as they took breaks. I imagine men and women building that wall, each with their own strength and all of them with their own weaknesses. All of those people with their own individual hopes and dreams for what might be ahead for all of them. But all of them focused on building that wall together. Coach Isaiah Berry of Winder Barrow High School knew the power of a good group project. And because he wanted his boys to be a team, to work together, he called up an ancient story of his own faith to rally them to the cause. And the thing is, we have this chance too. It's our story too, this short little bit of Nehemiah. And it tells us something so very important. Nehemiah's story tells us that no matter what, all is not lost. That no matter how hopeless we might feel about our personal lives or our national climate or anything else, all is not lost. That no matter how chaotic and angry the world might seem, all is not lost. And that no matter what church attendance looks like or how big church budgets might be, all is not lost. And I don't know about you, but I need to hear that phrase, all is not lost, just about every day of my life lately. It is a crazy time to be alive. You know it, and I know it. But maybe, just maybe, we're actually really lucky to be alive in this moment. Because maybe this is our chance to remember who we are, to be reminded of what matters most, to find a way to love the world as we have first been loved, which I think is actually what church, as I understand it anyway, was all about in the first place. I don't know if Isaiah Berry is alive anymore. But I know that if I were to approach any of his former players and say, "So built we the wall," they would chant back without missing a beat, "So built we the wall." Still, even now. Because this is how deeply he ingrained in them the importance of working hard and of being part of something bigger than ourselves. It wasn't about any one of them individually, not even the star quarterback who got a full ride to Furman University. It was about all of them together because they were Coach Berry's boys. May our story as people of faith be so ingrained in us that we might remember who and whose we are. And that we might find a way of being in the world that reflects the love and grace that has brought us this far. And that we have been promised will continue to see us through. Amen.